Tonight on Nova. World War II was a technological chess match. No part of that race was more important than the struggle to perfect radar. What was the secret to victory? And how did it profoundly affect the future of American science? How do our lives still reverberate with these echoes of war?
A famous World War II airplane, the P-51, once escorted bombers over Germany. Now the pilot prepares his fighter plane for an unusual mission. Its mission now is to be a friendly, moving target to showcase an even more influential relic of World War II, radar. The electronic eye that allowed the Allies to scope out the enemy through fog, clouds, and the dark of night. It turned the tide of many a battle, and it also dramatically changed the lives of these men, the scientists and engineers who developed radar nearly 50 years ago.
But there were modulators when I got there in January of 41.
Yeah, but it sure looks a bit beat up, doesn't it? Maybe this one saw war duty. He did it! Oh my God! Oh, what a sight! What a sight!
You're looking very chipper.
From all around the nation, they've reunited to show that they've kept their experience not only close to their hearts,
That's a long time ago, Hank. And
It sure is.
we did have an...
but at their fingertips as well.
I'll try the same place. Go back and forth a few times, see if we spot anything.
From inside the radar trailer, they look for the target plane, just as they searched for enemy aircraft during the war.
We'll look for him in the northwest quadrant, see if we can pick him up on the way in. I don't spot anything yet. Did you see something?
Yeah, I saw you go.
Wait a minute, I'll go back. He's gonna be a little closer. There he is. Try him again. See if you got him. Ready? Ready to lock on him.
Once they zero in on the target, the radar automatically tracks the plane.
Isn't that great? No hands.
No hands. Look at that go.
This tracking equipment was a technological feat, one made possible when civilian scientists joined forces with the military to fight the Second World War.
World War II has been called the physicist's war, and radar was one of the main reasons. Both sides were advancing so rapidly, making technical advances so rapidly that the scientific teams on each side were constantly faced with the problem of being up against a new innovation created by the enemy and being responsible for countermeasures to counteract that. And what it created was a back and forth pressure on scientific communities to not only innovate, but then respond to the next level of innovation. It created a hothouse atmosphere. What radar did was introduce a new technology that dramatically changed the nature of warfare, and it's almost impossible to imagine what that war would have been like without radar.
The story of radar actually began long before World War II, when A. Hoyt Taylor and Leo Young, two civilian scientists employed by the Navy, set out to conduct routine communication experiments on an arm of the Potomac River. One September day in 1922, the scientists set up a shortwave radio receiver to pick up signals from a transmitter on the other side of the river. They tuned into the steady hum of the transmission. But the hum suddenly died down, A steamer passing down the river had interrupted the signal. Taylor and Young had stumbled upon the basic principle behind radar. Radio waves can be reflected by objects in their path. The scientists immediately thought of a military application for this chance discovery. They could put a transmitter on one side of a harbor, a receiver on the other. If an enemy ship tried to sneak in at night, it would signal its presence by a disruption in the otherwise steady flow of radio waves. Over the years, Navy researchers refined this scheme, bringing the separate components closer together into a single unit. Now the transmitter would send a pulsed outgoing radio wave, and then the receiver would pick up the echo of that wave, bouncing off a target. Such a system would be able to detect distant airplanes as well as ships. This was radar, an acronym for radio detection and ranging. By the late 1930s, the U.S. military had its first primitive radar sets. Training films soon followed to explain to recruits the principles behind this new technology.
Radar was born with the discovery that radio waves, like sound waves, echo. But here, let's ask an expert on these things. How about it, Joe?
Yeah, that's right. Now watch. Hello? Hello? Hello?
The analogy to sound is good, but radio waves, like visible light, really are a form of electromagnetic radiation, so they travel at the speed of light. If a radio wave could travel around the world, it would make the trip 7.5 times in just 1 second. This allows for quick detection of targets.
When the radar antenna sends out its pulses, they bounce back from the unknown target, and the result is seen as a peak on the radar screen. Reading this pattern, the distance and speed of an approaching plane are charted.
These basic principles were also discovered independently by scientists in other countries, most notably Great Britain and Germany. But the spark that gave life to the new technology was the coming World War. By the late 30s, Germany had invaded Eastern Europe and was looking to the west. Across the Channel, Great Britain appeared to conduct business as usual. But in these countryside quarters, scientists were assembled for secret research. They too had discovered that radio waves can detect objects in their path. Their mission? Use this discovery to plan a defense of their vulnerable island against attack from Germany. The scientists convinced the government to line the coast with a network of radar antennas. These chain home stations, as they were called, transmitted radio waves to detect the German planes that began to attack in the summer of 1940. The towers were linked to central stations where the information was coordinated and transferred onto a map of incoming enemy aircraft. It was a primitive system, but it eliminated the element of surprise, allowing the Royal Air Force to shoot down enough German planes each day to eventually win the Battle of Britain. Across the Atlantic, many Americans wanted no part of Europe's war. They looked to the president for reassurance.
This nation will remain a neutral nation, but I cannot ask that every American remain neutral in thought as well. Even a neutral has a right to take account of facts. Even a neutral cannot be asked to close his mind or to close his conscience.
One American whose account of the facts drove him to action was Vannevar Bush, once Dean of Engineering at MIT. Bush was sure the United States would eventually be drawn into the war, and he feared Americans would be unprepared. Unlike Great Britain, America had not yet harnessed its scientific community to address military needs. Bush decided to have a hand in changing this. In a 4-paragraph paper, Bush proposed a new agency of civilian scientists, which he would head, to invent new weapons of war. It was a daring move, for its success depended on unprecedented cooperation between the scientific community and the armed services.
In the United States, we had a rather sorry history of this collaboration going back to World War I, when the military at least perceived that the scientific and technical communities had let them down. They'd made significant contributions, but the cooperation that they had expected wasn't as effective as they had wanted. And there was a cooling between the two and something of an alienation between the wars.
In June of 1940, Bush went right to the top, taking his proposal into the Oval Office. In a matter of minutes, President Roosevelt gave his approval. It was more than a year before the United States would enter the war, but Bush's plan to mobilize civilian scientists was launched, and he would become a wartime celebrity. Top priority for the new civilian agency was the development of radar more sophisticated than the existing U.S. military sets. This required one important change. Existing radar transmitted at low frequencies or long wavelengths, from one peak of a radio wave to another measured 1 to 10 meters or more. The civilian scientists hoped to transmit shorter or microwaves, only 10 centimeters from crest to crest. Microwaves would make it easier to generate a narrow beam, more accurate in pinpointing the direction and height of a target. The shorter wavelengths could distinguish between targets closer together. And while long-wavelength radar requires large antenna components, microwave sets could be made from smaller ones that could easily fit into planes. But there was an obstacle to microwave radar at the time. No one knew how to generate sufficiently high power at the shorter wavelengths. Could microwaves ever be generated with enough power to reach distant objects? Bush's Microwave Committee, having spent the summer of 1940 looking for the answer, decided to write a report. A sign, one member said, that they didn't know what to do next. As it turned out, the solution lay in war-torn England, where in early 1940, 2 British physicists, Randall and Boot, had invented the key to microwave radar, a little powerhouse called a multi-cavity magnetron. They knew the cavities, shown here in cross-section, would generate microwaves because wavelength is linked to component size. But could the tiny part generate microwaves with enough strength and power to reach distant targets? To get a quick estimate, the scientists hooked up their invention to see whether it could power large electric lamps. The experiment was a glowing success, and the boldest leap ever in the history of radar. But how successfully could the new invention be developed in battle-scarred England? Officials feared the Battle of Britain would push the country to the limits of its productive capacity. The government decided on a bold move. The precious cavity magnetron, with other top-secret equipment, was packed in a black trunk to be shipped to the United States in an appeal for help.
When the British had stolen a march on everyone technologically by discovering the magnetron. Then they had to decide what to do with it. And they were deciding that in the context of being the sole surviving adversary of Germany now. This came about during the time of the fall of France and the spectacular triumph of the German war machine, which had essentially run roughshod over all of continental Europe. And England was left alone. They had their backs against the wall. They needed all the help that they could get, and they had to take a chance on trusting the United States.
The cavity magnetron was shipped across the Atlantic in the custody of a member of the British radar team. It was later described as the most valuable cargo ever brought to our shores. The magnetron arrived in the fall of 1940 and was placed in the hands of American scientists eager to exploit the breakthrough to make new and better radar. MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, agreed to house the new project. With academia opening its doors to military matters, civilian science would never be the same again. The project began in a single office in the university's main building. But the sprawling campus soon began to relinquish space, building by building, to the new radar project. It expanded outward and upward, eventually sprouting strange domes to hide the secret experiments within. In October 1940, recruits arrived to work on a project whose details were top secret, even to them. One was a young engineer, Emmanuel Maxwell.
I was told about this big project that was going on at MIT, and somebody was coming down to recruit people. Would I be interested? And I said, fine, because it sounded like something I'd like to. Well, I was going to say it sounded like something I'd like to get into. Of course, I didn't know what I was getting into. In fact, I didn't really know what the project was until I arrived here.
An early assignment? Give the secret project a code name. Harvard physicist Norman Ramsey.
I think none of us had even heard of the word radar at the time, so we wanted something to be a reasonable name, but at the same time give away no secrets, maybe even mislead people. And the thought was that we could call it the radiation laboratory, because there was in Berkeley a very important radiation laboratory working on nuclear physics. This might make people think we were working on nuclear physics and maybe on trying to develop a nuclear bomb, which at that time looked like a very way out, very unlikely event.
Control of the Rad Lab was turned over to the nation's leading physicists. Among the leaders was Isidore Isaac Rabi, a recruit from Columbia University. Rabi, who emigrated from Eastern Europe at an early age, was among the best and brightest who would transform American physics. While he was not the official director of the Rad Lab, Rabi was considered by many to be its heart and soul.
Rabi was an idea man, an extremely good one, a philosopher. I think he set the spirit and tone of what the radiation lab was all about.
But one of his virtues was that he was critical of things, and he would sometimes start a student off on a problem, and then he wouldn't see the student for a while, say, what are you working on? The student would reply to him what Rabi had first told him about the problem, and Rabi would be very apt to say, well, that's a terrible waste of time. What are you wasting your time on such a stupid thing as that? The student would be sort of shattered, but it did make him think, and you quickly learned not to say the work was important because Rabi said it was important, but you had to say it was important because it was important, and why.
When early Rad Lab recruits found the cavity magnetron baffling, Rabi told them, it's simple. It's just a kind of whistle. Indeed, the cavity magnetron works much like or even simpler forms of wind instruments. Here, wind blows over the air inside, sound waves at a wavelength dependent on the cavity. Tipped on its side, the bottle resembles one of the 8 cavities in a cavity magnetron. Now, instead of wind, electrons blow over the cavities, exciting them. And instead of sound, electromagnetic waves, the waves of radar, are generated at a wavelength set by the size of the cavity. The cavity magnetron was just the start. To make use of it for radar, the Rad Lab set out to create almost from scratch an entire new field, microwave electronics. For the physicists who now had to focus on only those theories that could quickly be transformed into technologies of war, it was a new experience. Physicist Al Hill.
Physicists learned a good many things. They learned they couldn't take a detached point of view from what went on in the world, either philosophically, politically, or in the making of devices. It also taught us that there was a great deal to be said for team research. Research by physicists had been almost entirely individual, or one man and two students before the war.
With different teams concentrating on different components, the Rad Lab assembled its first prototype radar in less than 3 months. The microwave radar was set up to test from a Rad Lab rooftop. When it successfully picked up an echo from the dome of the Christian Science Mother Church, visible across the river, a coded telegram was rushed off to let officials in on the secret. The Rad Lab's first complete experimental radar had worked. Rooftop experiments were part of the Rad Lab's first priority project, the development of a radar that could be installed in airplanes to detect enemy planes at night. The British were anxious for this air-based radar as a supplement to their ground-based chain-home system, because Germany had turned to night bombing.
The period between September and November 1940 has been referred to as the Great Fire of London. On one night, 1,500 fires were started by German bombs.
The Rad Lab went right to work on a system to meet this crisis. But in a matter of months, the night attacks diminished, and so did the British interest. In the United States, the military displayed a similar lack of interest in aircraft intercept radar, perhaps reflecting indifference toward radar technology in general. But all that was to change abruptly Sunday morning, December 7th, 1940. On the Hawaiian island of Oahu, the Army had installed one of its ground-based longer wavelength radar sets. Monitoring the radar scope that morning was a 19-year-old private, Joseph Lockard.
Almost immediately after 7 o'clock, we had the response from the equipment indicated what was to me the largest echo I'd ever seen on the equipment. At first, I thought there was something wrong with the machine, so I ran through a series of tests, but it proved to be operable, and what was there was there.
Lockard twice contacted an officer on duty, but was told not to worry. An hour later, he discovered he had been watching Japanese planes approach Pearl Harbor. When word spread that radar had actually warned of this attack, the U.S. military took notice.
The best thing that came out of it was an acceptance of the value of the equipment. It was no longer considered a toy, but a useful defense mechanism.
The military was warming toward radar, but it was still cool toward the civilian scientists who wanted to develop newer, more accurate models. Would these systems become a part of the U.S. arsenal, or remain just an academic experiment? In his office in Washington, the Secretary of War himself was ready to challenge the traditional distrust of civilian scientists. Henry Stimson wanted his own personal advisor on radar. In April of 1942, he summoned an electrical engineering professor from the radiation laboratory, Edward L. Bowles.
I was a novice. I wasn't at home in the military structure. I was not conversant with the work of the Navy and the Army Air Corps. All I knew was what I read in the newspapers. So I found myself in a bewildering wilderness.
He was an ambassador of radar deep within the military, and the progress of the Rad Lab depended on his diplomacy. So Bowles maneuvered with caution, subtly cultivating the right sources.
So I always went to Elizabeth Neary, Stimson's secretary. And she gave me the lie of the land, as only a woman could, say I. If I wanted to make an appointment with Mr. Stimson, she would say, I don't think this is a good morning. Eleanor will be here, namely Eleanor Roosevelt.
Bowles' first assignment: assess if radar could play a role in making the North Atlantic safe from German submarines. These lethal U-boats threatened to cut off Britain, whose very existence depended on the supplies it got by sea. This was perhaps the most critical battle of the Second World War. Faced with this new crisis, the Rad Lab redirected its earlier priority project. It converted the now less crucial aircraft intercept radar into sets that combed the ocean surface, picking up signals from submarines and other vessels. In Washington, Bowles used his influence to see that such airborne radar be used in regular search and destroy missions. Submarines could be detected when they surfaced to recharge their batteries. Up until this time, the U.S. military had relied on Navy convoys to defend against the German U-boats. Airborne radar radically transformed anti-submarine strategy.
Perhaps the most important use of radar in World War II was in the submarine war. If we had lost the Battle of the Atlantic to the U-boat threat, if England had simply been starved into submission, then we would have lost a base from which to launch an invasion into Europe. And after that, it gets very iffy. But it's a very real possibility that the United States would simply have had to accept a negotiated settlement with the Germans.
By the summer of 1943, the use of airborne radar helped Allied convoys proceed safely in areas that had been treacherous only a short time before. Now the radiation laboratory was in the war for keeps. A new era of cooperation between civilian scientists and the military had begun. Pilots and other military personnel visited the Rad Lab, bringing ideas for new radar and feedback on devices already deployed. MIT professor Louis Smullen.
They came with their problems. They needed help. They were not too proud to ask for it, so that we had a very interesting atmosphere where I, as a young man of 24, could tell a colonel, now, Colonel, you don't really understand what this is all about. If I'd been in uniform, no way could I have said that. If I'd been a private or a sergeant or even a captain, I couldn't have said, Colonel, you don't know what you're talking about.
Rad Lab engineers themselves made hundreds of different trips to the war zone. When two top Rad Lab scientists journeyed to the front to speak with General Patton, he knew such interaction would have lasting consequences and said, "This is the way wars not only can, but must be run from now on." By the end of 1943, the laboratory had grown to occupy 15 of floor space. Telephone operators at the Rad Lab controlled the largest switchboard in Cambridge. Among the 4,000 who worked at the lab were 8 who would win the Nobel Prize and 2 who would be presidential science advisors. But in 1943, every member of the lab's vast staff was working not for civilian honors, but for military victory.
It probably was the last, let me say, good war, in the sense that we all felt we knew what we're, maybe not what we were fighting for, what we were fighting against. You have to remember, we were civilians. We had neighbors our age who were drafted and who didn't come back. I suspect it was a curious mixture of guilt, of excitement, because it was a very exciting time, technically. New things were happening and you were involved in them. And a desire to win, certainly not to lose.
Now new radar sets were moving quickly from the lab to the battlefield. The Rad Lab contracted with more than 70 companies to mass produce parts and assemble whole sets. GE and Raytheon made magnetrons. RCA manufactured receivers. Westinghouse, Philco, and Western Electric also were in on the act, making parts for dozens of different radar systems. It was the beginning of a powerful academic, military, industrial complex. One of the Rad Lab's priority projects was to develop a ground-based radar accurate enough to fix upon a moving target and automatically track it. This radar, called the SCR-584, was connected via early computers to anti-aircraft guns, which in turn were directed to the correct firing point. Rad Lab alumni recall early tests of the set.
Some of you fellows don't probably understand or know a lot about how the early tests on 584 were done before it became 584. And this is a test reel. And the test reels were made by taking a 16mm camera, mounting it on the parabola so it pointed in the same direction that the parabola pointed, and then photographing the airplane that it was supposed to be tracking. And our measurement of whether it was working at all was, did it stay on the plane? And if it was really honing in on it and doing the job beautifully, we had nice stationary pictures of an airplane with the clouds moving along behind it, and the thing would just lock on it like a rock no matter where that airplane went. There are pictures of the set, and there are probably pictures of the airplane itself farther along on the reel.
During tests of an early model of this radar, the experimenters discovered that their piece of military hardware could automatically track a less than threatening target. A telegram was sent to the Rad Lab to share the news. The radar had tracked seagulls.
Well, we all looked at that telegram and says it has to be some sort of a secret code, because we knew everything was classified and couldn't talk, and we were trying to decipher what he meant by tracking seagulls. And the hard fact was, that was true. That's all he did, was to track seagulls.
Indeed, cryptic messages were expected because all information about radar was top secret. But even secure facilities could not always keep secrets from falling into enemy hands. In early 1943, the Germans pulled a badly damaged microwave radar set from a downed British plane. They tediously reassembled and copied the components. In test flights, they discovered the phenomenal resolution of short-wavelength radar. Now they too attempted to exploit microwave technology. but it was too late to catch up.
Hitler literally grew complacent, and he drew back on not only his research and development, but also his industrial production. And that went on for 2 years until in 1942, after the invasion of Russia, he begins to realize that this isn't going to be as easy as he imagined and that they're in for a long-term war. And then he tries to crank it up belatedly. And by that time, the United States research and development sort of infrastructure is in full gear, and of course the British have been working for a long time, and the Germans were simply never able to catch up.
But the Germans had employed ground-based long-wave radar from early on in the war. Even these more primitive systems presented a threat that couldn't be ignored. Back in Massachusetts, a laboratory was set up at Harvard to take measures against enemy radar. Here, scientists developed a method to jam enemy systems, dropping strips of aluminum foil called chaff. Chief of chaff at Harvard, astronomer Fred Whipple.
People wondered where the foil went on the cigarette packages during World War II. Well, it went into these things. There were hundreds of thousands of tons of it used.
Foil length depended on the wavelength to be jammed. The proper length reflected the radar waves, causing many blips to appear on the scope, making it difficult to tell which was the true target.
Sometimes when it was first used, the operators thought that the radar was in trouble, you see. There's something wrong with the radar, so they would tear it apart and try to find out what was wrong.
German scientists, too, devised countermeasures, creating electromagnetic noise to make it difficult to find ground targets. This German footage, captured during the war, shows reflectors being constructed to try to confuse airborne radar. Such countermeasures put a higher premium on microwave radar, which were then harder to jam.
Whenever a new technology as important as radar comes along, it cannot be ignored by an enemy or a potential enemy. It drives everyone to develop their technology to respond to it, to create appropriate countermeasures. And those countermeasures, in turn, invite countermeasures and drive this technological race on ad infinitum. And in the process, changes the nature of warfare.
By 1943, the war in the air was being fought not over Britain, but over Germany, where the Allies were on the offensive to crush the Nazi war machine. German ball bearing plants, airplane factories, oil refineries, all had to be destroyed. All were deemed by the Allies to be high-priority strategic targets. Finding these targets was no easy task for the Allied squadrons that relied on what were then standard means of navigation: visual landmarks, dead reckoning, celestial guides.
Navigation leading up to World War II and even through the war was so bad that there are countless instances where aircraft on both sides not only did not hit the right target within a city, didn't even hit the right city.
To aid in navigation, the British designed a system to guide aircraft from Great Britain with two ground station radar called Cat and Mouse. The plane flew along a path at a constant range from the Cat station until it reached a predetermined distance from the Mouse station, the bomb release point. The proper course was communicated to the pilot by tones. A steady one confirmed the pilot was on course. Dots and dashes warned the plane was off to the right or left. The tones gave the system its code name, Oboe. Oboe guided one Pathfinder plane to a target over Germany. There, the Pathfinder dropped flares to mark where the rest of the squadron should release its bombs. Oboe at first relied on long-wave radar, but questions were soon raised about how long these missions could continue before the enemy began jamming that frequency. So the Rad Lab developed a newer microwave version of this set to keep ahead in this measure-countermeasure war. After missions, Rad Lab engineers would fine-tune the new equipment with help from an unexpected source, the enemy itself.
Within a few hours, there was a broadcast from Germany talking about the heathens, the swines, the Englishmen who had desecrated a cathedral or had bombed a church or bombed. And then the oboe technicians would get these reports and we'd say, gee, we're a little bit long today. And you tweak up the equipment to change the aiming point by 1/8 of a mile or so.
Oboe was not foolproof. It required precise timing, and the enemy could foil a mission by dropping its own flares to confuse the squadrons. It became clear that new technologies of themselves were not enough.
And I remember one terrible day when maybe 70% of the cots were empty that night. All those bright young people who came over. I got over into a raid, and there was a trap set for them, obviously, and never made it home. So it all wasn't red and roses. There were many times when you had a down day because of what the Germans were capable of doing.
Because oboe relied on ground radar based in Great Britain, it was limited in range. So as the strategic bombing offensive penetrated deeper over German airspace, the focus shifted to another navigational aid, a new airborne radar that would enable squadrons to engage in blind bombing missions.
The weather bears out the forecast. Clouds, heavy overcast, all the way to the target. If the enemy took comfort in the thought that the bombardier sees nothing more than this, they were living in a fool's paradise. For at a calculated instant, tons of high explosives would be sent away to the target, aimed by the miracle of radar.
This new radar operated at the shortest wavelength in wide use during the war. Radar entered the war at wavelengths of 1 to 10 meters. Early airborne and ground-based radar operated at a more precise 10 centimeters. But from the start, the Rad Lab was determined to achieve even shorter wavelengths, 3 centimeters. The earliest model tested near Boston Harbor, though, was far from the miracle radar they had hoped for.
Of course, the first flight, nothing worked. It was terrible. I mean, we flew over, initially we flew over little boats and then bigger boats, and we kept asking for still bigger boats to see something while the pilot was getting a little bit annoyed with us not seeing anything on radar. And finally we flew over a ship and said, we'll find a bigger one. He pointed out that was the Queen Mary we had just flown over, so that obviously that was a bad start.
The problem lay in the pipe that sent the waves out to the antenna. After weeks of tinkering, they were ready to fly again.
Then on one of the missions, after the equipment was working very well, we actually came across a German submarine fairly near the Boston Harbor, and the pilots were really annoyed at that time because they had no munitions or anything aboard. The only thing they could do was throw a monkey wrench at the submarine.
But the most dramatic success of the new 3-centimeter sets was this radar presentation of Cape Cod that looked amazingly similar to an actual map, shown here on the right. No previous form of radar could produce this kind of detail. This ability to image the ground gave the Air Force a more flexible navigational tool than land-based radar systems. Deep over Germany, crews dropped their bombs from 30,000 feet on targets often seen only on radar. Up until this time, the U.S. Air Force had confined itself mainly to bombing in daylight during good weather, when targets could be located visually. But this meant the squadrons themselves could be seen, and losses rose to a crippling 30%. With 3-centimeter radar, missions could take place at night or in overcast weather, helping to protect squadrons. There was a trade-off, however. Radar missions weren't as precise as visual means in isolating military from civilian targets. This created a new tension in military strategy.
The issue of precision bombing versus blind bombing raises a wonderful paradox about this new technology, which gave to us a capability to conduct strategic bombardment in a way that was entirely unanticipated, and yet it did not lead in the policy direction that we wanted to go. What we wanted our technology to do was give us more precise bombardment so that we would avoid collateral casualties, indiscriminate civilian casualties. Radar helped us move in the other direction.
Despite this dilemma, 3-centimeter radar was adopted. This development, along with the deployment of the P-51, a new long-range fighter escort to protect squadrons, made widespread bombing of Germany possible. Radar's contribution here was to keep Allied planes flying when they otherwise would have been grounded during bad weather, allowing the enemy no long periods of rest. This unrelenting strategic bombing softened Germany's defenses in preparation for the invasion of France. In the summer of 1944, it was clear that Germany was losing the war. Still, it had one more technological punch to deliver. The V-1s, or buzz bombs.
There were efforts to shoot these things down with fighters, but the fighters didn't like it, because if they succeeded in destroying the buzz bomb, they were triggering off the explosives in it. And so the airplane had to fly through all that debris. These things appeared at random, and nobody knew where they were going to drop. There was that horrible period where you heard the buzz come along. I know because I heard them. And the question was, when are they going to stop buzzing?
With their constant speed and predictable elevation, the German V-1s proved easy prey for the Radlab's SCR 584s. On the final day of the Blitz in London, out of 104 bombs clocked coming across, only 4 actually got by them. The war was nearly over in Europe, but it continued to rage in the war in the Pacific was largely engagements between carrier forces, with low-flying planes attacking enemy fleets. Radar wasn't as critical in this arena, but it did support the massive air raids and landings on numerous Pacific islands as the Allies moved ever closer to the expected invasion of Japan itself. In the South Pacific battlefield, radar operators soon discovered that the radiation lab had neglected to take into account the need to tropicalize the radar sets to protect the equipment against the ravages of the environment. Dispatched there to help with the SCR 584 radar was Hank Abasian.
The inside of that radar was the saddest sight you've ever seen. There was fungus growth all over everything. The sandbags had been moist in here, had been stacked in here. Well, clean up, of course, everything, take everything apart and wash it down and clean up. I could never bring that radar up to the performance standard that I knew it should meet. Get it up quite a bit, but never to what it should be.
But even up to speed, the SCR 584 had certain limitations. Sent to patrol the skies, the radar and its operators were vulnerable to enemy attacks by land.
So this one night, sleeping in my cot out front, I hear all this machine gun fire and sleeping there sort of semi-sleep. I said, well, that machine gun out there just blasting away. And then I heard Japanese talk. It wasn't English talk. I knew that. And I woke up, and sure enough, the Japanese party raiding party had come down from the hills and had set up a machine gun off the back end of this radar. And they blasted away. And if I had been sleeping there that night, someone else would have been in this interview, dear. Someone else.
The bomb didn't take everyone at the Rad Lab by surprise. After all, a handful of their colleagues had been siphoned off to work on it, disappearing officially to a P.O. box in Los Alamos, New Mexico. When I.I. Robbie was initially asked to join the bomb project, he declined. I refused, he said, because I was serious about the war. Maybe we could have won it without the atomic bomb, but without radar, we could have lost it.
It is difficult to choose the right word to describe radar's contribution to the outcome of the war. Enthusiasts for radar want to say it was decisive. Practically everybody will allow that it contributed significantly to the outcome of the war, which sounds rather bland. The truth is probably someplace in between those. That is, radar did not by itself, nor did any other technology, determine the outcome of the war in the way that the term decisive suggests. But it understates the case to say that it simply contributed, because it did more than contributed. It changed the whole nature of World War II, and it's almost impossible to imagine what that war would have been like without radar.
On August 14th, 1945, at a convocation celebrating victory over Japan, Director Lee DeBridge announced plans for closing the radiation lab.
That was the finest organization I've ever worked for. And when that day come to say goodbye, I got around about 3 people, and I couldn't do it anymore. Couldn't do it.
The rooftop radar were knocked down, the labs stripped of equipment. Their mission was over, but the wartime work left peacetime legacies, from radio astronomy's probe of the universe to radar control of civilian air traffic. Radar also left an indelible mark on military technology. In the fall of 1945, MIT held a proud public demonstration of the role science and technology played in the war effort. Radar was one of the stars, and a symbol of the measure-countermeasure race the superpowers would continue in the post-war world. After World War II, the use of extensive radar networks meant that strategic bombers could be detected long before they reached their targets. The evolution of bomber technology now would be inextricably linked to advances in radar. Today, the unveiling of the stealth bomber, purported to evade radar, is the latest chapter in this ongoing measure-countermeasure story. But in the end, the history of radar is about more than new hardware. It is also a story of the high expectations held for science and technology since the Second World War.
World War II was a war of industrial production, as World War I had been. That is, the Allies won because we simply swamped the Axis with more people, more material, and whatnot. But it was also a war in which we learned to do consistent, conscientious, planned research and development for purposes of war. And it spawned the perception that is still abroad in the world today that the next world war will be won by science and technology. And the radiation lab was the model for that perception.